Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Tips for Enhancing Provider Schedules to Increase Revenue. A few housekeeping items before we get started. The telephone lines have been muted, so attendees are in listen-only mode. You can ask questions that will be answered at the end of the presentation through the GoToMeeting chat window. We will also be sending out a short evaluation survey at the end of the webinar along with today's slides. We ask that you please take a few minutes and complete the survey. Your feedback is very important to us. You will also be able to ask additional questions that we can pass on to the presenter if you would like to. So with that, I will hand it off. I would like to say welcome to Mr. Cameron Cox. And Cam, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Jean. I appreciate it. I am honored today to actually be a presenter for you guys, tell you just a little bit about me, just so the listeners can understand kind of my background. I have been a practice administrator. I own a consulting firm that deals primarily with independent physician practices in multiple states. I most recently have actually been an interim CEO for a large orthopedic group, so I got my hands dirty again, so to speak. So I'm not just a consultant, but an actual doer. So my hope is that many of you, when you listen to the presentation today, will kind of understand that some of my recommendations and ideas actually come from sitting in the chair and dodging the bullets, so to speak. So that being said, so we'll get started. First of all, typically I've done numerous webinars, but I also present a lot in person, and a lot of times I use a lot of facial expressions. Unfortunately, I can't show you guys my different facial expressions, so I thought I would actually give you guys some additional quotes as we go through this presentation, because this presentation's goal, primary objective, is to get you to think just a little bit differently about the scheduling system and the scheduling operations within any practice. So a few quotes: always won't open new doors, new mindset, new results. You can read these yourselves, but basically my goal is for you guys to think differently. If the words weren't enough, because I am visual, some people are word oriented and some people are visual oriented, I was trying to give you some different perspective on how the world's going to look going forward. And our jobs as administrators is to, I think a lot of times, and this is the funny one, was to really stand on our head. I think a lot of administrators, that actually feels like sometimes our primary responsibility is to stand on our head and do what is different. So with that being said, let's take a step back just for a moment to think about why we need to think differently with our scheduling system and other caveats within our practice. 2018 landscape looked a lot like this, and we're rolling into 2019, really on the same curve, the upwards curve. We have all kinds of competition to our practices these days. If you're an independent practice, it's even more intense. There are urgent cares. There's a development of mega groups. Health systems, some of you I'm sure who are on the call today are part of health systems. Nothing wrong with that. It's just simply a new player in the environment for all of us. There's retail clinics actively pushing. I have intensely stayed on various websites with retail clinics, specifically Walgreens, just to watch the culmination of it as it matures. One of the similarities that I've thought about when looking at the Walgreens websites with regards to the ability to schedule yourself online, I've thought a lot about like Great Clips, which is a hair cutting place, which I know seems sort of silly, but it's actually very similar in scope and nature. So that's why I put them on here, that the competition is really, really intense. And it's really because it's about consumerism. When you throw telemedicine into the equation, it gets even more complicated. I read recently an article that had nothing to do with healthcare. It actually had to do with the use of robotics in grocery stores. With the advent of online grocery shopping and online pickup, robotics are the new avenue. And one of the discussions in there I thought was interesting was the CEO said the consumer today is time starved. And I thought about that, and I thought about it, how it actually relates to healthcare. And many times we actually forget that the person on the other end of the phone is, quote, time starved, and their time is precious. And that's why the rest of the world is moving at such a quick pace to actually solve those time elements and those time problems. So as we start this, the most important tip that I want to share with you is we cannot have the same mentality. If you're hoping down the side of that to come up with like a little cool word, there's not one there. I did that just to sort of poke fun at it, but I wanted you guys to think this way. This is the most important tip that you walk away with today. The way you've always done scheduling and the way you're doing scheduling now, some of you are actually may already be progressing forward, but the way we're doing scheduling and have historically done it is going to be a problem in the future. We just cannot have the same mentality that we've always had. And that's a challenge a lot of times for physicians. They've started their businesses, they're in motion, and they don't like change. This is a group of business owners who really typically do not like any modification or alteration to the way they have done things historically, and they see no need to change things going into the future. And for that, I would challenge the thinking that our jobs as administrators is exactly this, is we have to change the mentality. We have to change it. This actually came at a presentation when I was doing a presentation for, I believe it was Florida MGMA. I had technical difficulties and I was beginning to sweat on stage. My presentation was at 4 o'clock. It was 4:05 and I was sitting in front of a room full of people, realizing that I could not start the presentation, and became more and more nervous. And I actually stopped for a moment and thought about that. And the question popped in my mind, because we all have brochures when we go to our MGMA events, and the brochure is a schedule. It's a schedule of events. The expectation when you show up in a room at 4 o'clock to hear a presenter speak is that that presenter is going to start speaking at 4 o'clock. Just like today, all of you logged on, you had a schedule of events. 12 o'clock, you were supposed to hear an amazingly brilliant, just fantastic speaker, theoretically, start at noon. So then it got to me in my head is, whose schedule is it? Is it the doctor's schedule? Is it the PA schedule? And that's what it dawned on me, that actually one of the things that we actually tend to do is we actually build it for the physician. In reality, in fact, it is the patient's schedule. Just like today's presentation, this is your schedule, not mine. I didn't alter it. I didn't actually say, if you guys could just wait. I'm talking to another group of people that are equally important to you, and their time is equally as valuable. I just would like you to understand. That's a hard thing to actually contemplate, but it actually is very true. That's the way consumers of the world today are thinking. It is their schedule. It is their time. They are time starved. This is actually a big area of concern. I actually highlight this, and I try to highlight in the various components of my presentation the impact area to think about from a customer service standpoint or a marketing standpoint. When I was doing the interim gig, we repeatedly had online reviews about long wait times. The way to solve a long wait time is to fix the long wait time. It's not to go back to the patients necessarily and try to coax them into understanding. It's more importantly, how can we fix that? And as we go through this presentation, we'll talk a little bit about that. But this is the blasphemy tip. This is the one where if you say this to doctors, they will be sort of offended. But our job, again, is to think about, how do we fix this problem to come up with the balance and the solution between both the doctor's time as well as the patient's time. My next one is more than a no-show tip. A lot of times our focus is hypothetically on what is my no-show rate, things of that magnitude. And as though I find those valuable, my problem with no-show tips is a little bit different. My problem is I think that you should be using your scheduling data to diagnose the data more than just gauge of work. We should be analyzing this data in a different format to better understand the customer. This actually came about because of my thought process, or an article I read, that really there was a lot of information in the customers of Walmart and Target. And again, I know that I go off on analogies, but I just try to think about how other industries see customers and apply that. It's not always unilateral, and it's not always a one-to-one ratio, but there is a lot of information that we can learn about that. We don't have to go, all Facebook on the data, but we should start to use it effectively. A simple start is just to break the data down into simple categories, such as gender or age, etc., to begin to get a picture of our patients. And again, the article that I read actually was interesting because it actually talked about the average salary, or excuse me, the average income of a Walmart customer was, I think it was something like $45,000. I can't remember exactly, but the target customer was $60-some thousand, and it just dawned on me that how much information they knew about you before you even walked in the door. And I thought, where do we have that information? And right now, we actually know who's going to be walking in the door for the rest of the month or the rest of the week or whatever, but what do we know about that customer before they already walk in? This is why I suggest that what we start to do with our scheduling information is to start breaking down into categories. And I'll show you an example of some of the ways in which we try to rethink this. And we do it for a couple of different reasons. And if you start thinking about this differently, maybe this will help. And there's all kinds of ways to break this down. The first thing I did was actually to put it into ratios. And the reason I wanted to put it into ratios was to get an understanding of the impact. They also, you'll see in the very first category, one of the things I suggested that we did was we broke it down by age. And the reason I did that is because of the fact that age sometimes signifies how a patient may want to be communicated with. So for example, you'll see that my no-show rate in this category was higher in the 20 to 39 age category, and it might be because our practice is doing nothing but calling these patients. Well, as you all know, any phone call you get on your phone, you're somehow offended by. But if it's someone that you don't know and they're calling your cell phone, that's sort of an immediate offense. But if someone randomly texts you, that's not necessarily offensive. It's an oddity that actually comes with the use of cell phones. But it's one of the things that actually I began to think about was, is my no-show rate my fault because we're not communicating properly with the various age groups? I will say also that I've actually had these conversations with my parents who are in their 70s. Recently, my mother had her knee replaced, her second knee replaced, and my father was offended because they emailed him a patient reminder instead of calling him. I had to remind him of my dad, who has worked in healthcare for 40 years, that the point was that they actually successfully communicated with him. But it was interesting to have the conversation with him when he said, why didn't they call me? So again, I break the categories down so that I can begin to understand that not everyone may want to be communicated the same way. I thought about this also as I signed up for a recent flight I have on Southwest, and they asked me, how did I want to get my communications, via text or via email? As a 48-year-old man, my world is we are the email generation. We like emails, but I digress just to show you a little bit the difference. I also broke it down, you can see, by appointments, by location. Some practices actually have different types of organizations in different places, and sometimes those areas actually are an aggregate of what the expectations are. It could be that one location is an older population set than, say, a more urban environment or et cetera. The other one that I broke down to, and again, these are just examples, but ways of thinking differently about your data. As you can see, we actually found out that, surprise, surprise, on Fridays, we tend to have more no-shows. Now, this actually could have been capacity be that the patients are just going on an early leave or whatever the case may be. But again, it helps us to begin to understand the problem at a little bit lower level, a different core, if you will, of what may be causing some of our no-show problems. Again, the goal here is to actually think differently than just simply a no-show rate on an average or on a larger scale. Break it down into a lower level so we can actually begin to digest some of the problems inherent with the no-show problems that we may have. So here's a measure tip. So the measure tip is actually pretty straightforward in that what we want to do is analyze data to learn about average wait times. I think a lot of times we as an organizations, we don't think about what is our average wait times, and then actually begin to break those down sometimes. Break them out. Is it one specific provider? I've done this before when an OBGYN group, 5 providers, and one provider had a much higher average wait time for her patients than the other 4. And it was partly because of what she was doing. It was partly because of what kind of patients she had. But we still had to play because who was getting negatively impacted was the overarching organization. the negative tips were, or the negative comments in social media were actually coming at a practice level. So we really needed to solve that problem, and we would never have known what the problem was unless we understood it at that level. Once we learn this, you begin to share this information with staff. Don't just hold on to it. Actually reach out to others. Figure out, what can we do? How can we actually differentiate this? Is there something we can change? We need to change this provider schedule. We need to change these kind of patient schedules. Whatever the case would be, if we break it down and begin to measure this, we can begin to understand and make modifications to actually enhance the operations of the practice. Another idea, now that's sort of, again, it's kind of outside the box, is share this information with patients. Sometimes actually patients have great ideas about what could be done differently. If we're proactive, that's another concept. Text patients when wait times increase during the day. If you have patients who are at the back half of the day and you just simply let them know, just want to give you a heads up, Dr. So-and-so is running late. If you don't mind, please show up 30 minutes later, or whatever the case may be, but somehow be proactive in reaching out to those patients. I think you'll find a very positive customer service experience, because all of a sudden now you are demonstrating respect for their time. Again, I'm going to go back to those two words, time starved. People today are under a tremendous amount of pressure. If you think about a lot of times there are two people working in the household. Both of them are balancing their careers as well as their family life and trying to figure out when I can be home, when I can't be home, who has to pick up the kids, etc. Respecting the patient's time will pay you dividends in the customer service arena, particularly in the online reviews and the marketing aspect. One of the challenges that we typically think of in healthcare that we forget about is actually opportunity cost. The opportunity cost tip is an interesting tip, because some folks will actually, and I apologize, it's not intended to be offensive at all, but every patient is not worth the same. And it's not so much the patient as much as it is the carrier. What services and procedures are the most valuable, what payers are most valuable to the practice, stratify this in the schedule accordingly. And I'm going to show you this from a financial perspective. And again, just remember, I'm not suggesting that you treat people differently or whatever the case may be. Again, it goes back to understanding the value of what it is that we're doing on a daily basis. Here's a good example of what I mean by opportunity cost. For example, if you have, we'll use this Medicare patient example, this 99214 office visit, pretty standard in anyone's schedule. If you're seeing a Medicare patient in a slot at $86.39, the opportunity cost is the difference between that payer one number, 106.27, minus $86.39. That's your opportunity cost. That's the quote, the $20 that you are losing, if you will, in this scenario, because you weren't seeing a payer one patient in the room. Your resources are the same, the rent is still the same, everything's exactly the same, but now instead of making $106.27, we're making $86.39. The reason I highlight this is because in any schedule, a lot of times providers tend to focus exclusively on volume. Providers tend to say, well, yesterday I saw 25 patients. I don't understand why my reimbursement's so low, or whatever the case may be. As administrators, I think the simplicity of demonstrating this to providers is just to let them see and understand that this is the opportunity cost that comes with that. I highlight this sometimes with practices so that they actually can be very cautious and careful with regards to their contract negotiations going forward and the development of their schedules over time. If at all possible, scheduling appropriately to actually try to even this out as much as possible is helpful in looking at the revenue and actually understanding the differential in the reimbursement rates. This is probably, the next one is probably one of my favorite things to think about, because this is, all of us talk about this a lot. And I think any meeting that you go to, any MGMA meeting you go to, professional medical society meeting that you go to, etc., and all of us sitting here now simply want to do it ourselves. It's interesting. The let me do it tip is a hard one to let go of. I will refer all the way back to the very beginning of the blasphemy tip. Part of the reason why we actually have a dilemma in healthcare of letting patients book their own appointments online, one of the reasons is because we all will readily agree as we're sitting here that it's not the patient's schedule. It's the doctor's schedule. And it's partly why we close this off. Now, what I encourage you guys to rethink on this is that actually the ability to reduce some of your cost in the house if you begin to let patients book online themselves. Now, before you go back and everybody eye rolls with me and gets mad at me or whatever, what I want to say is we don't have to do everything all at once. It could be that we could go a little toe in the water on some of this. For example, I've met pediatric practices that what they actually do is all of their flu vaccinations, they actually let patients book those themselves online. So it could be that what we do is carve our schedules up and think differently again about what appointments do we feel comfortable letting patients book online. Now, certainly none of us are going to let patients book a knee replacement. I don't think I would ever let my mom book her own knee replacement online. But we can begin to think a little differently. If there are some appointments, follow-ups, 99024s in the global period, things of that magnitude, if there are some that we could actually encourage patients to go and book online themselves, it actually takes the pressure off the organization from a resource standpoint. In addition, it's one of the things that if we all think about this in every other industry that we all experience, it's what customers want to do. They want to actually be in charge of it themselves. Think about how many industries have been eliminated because we just simply want to do it ourselves. There are no longer travel agencies pretty much. Here and there might be, but basically you just go and do it yourself. You book it yourself. You actually have apps to go ahead and pre-order at McDonald's now, at Chick-fil-A, at Starbucks. We have this in our world, the rest of the world in which we're doing this. It's only in time that it's going to happen in healthcare. For us, though, we should begin to think about how do we implement this. One of our first fight backs is my system won't let me do it. There are companies out there that have this capability. I encourage all of you as administrators to go and start looking at it. Even if you can't make it work now, we should be trying to figure it out going forward. If you Google this, just simply do an online scheduling programs, you'll actually find a host of solutions. Quite honestly, the impact area here, as it says, is it's a customer service issue. This is one of those areas where if you look back to my very first slide, it's the blasphemy tip. And this is very, very, very difficult for us to push in an organizational standpoint, but it is an area where I think is an area we should be focusing on. If there's just one or two areas where you can actually introduce an online concept, I would encourage you to do so. I do know that some PM systems already do have this capability. I have heard from peers of mine that Athena Health actually has the ability to partially let the online schedule occur, and there's some other PM systems that also have done this. You can look at some examples like ZocDoc and some other independent programs like that. They actually have some interfaces. So I encourage you at the conclusion of this, if nothing else, just go and educate yourself on what might be available for your organization. The time tip, stay on time. It's one of the things that when I sit and I do presentations, particularly about online reviews, this is one of the inherent problems we all see is actually that I sat in the waiting room for an hour and a half. Some of the things that actually are even worse now is I've seen, and this is sort of a crazy thing, but I've actually seen someone sit in a waiting room with a Facebook Live going just to show how long they've been sitting in a waiting room. And the Facebook Live was simply all they were doing was actually showing the clock on the wall in the waiting room just ticking by, just in a live format of how long they had been there, which is kind of crazy. But if you start thinking about just the whole concept of the negativity that brought, it was sort of funny. Some of the comments were funny, but still in the end, it was actually horrible to witness. If the practice can't stay on time, inform your patients, let them know. I thought about this too when I took my kids to Disney. In Disney, you see this sign that says it's 120 minutes to ride the Peter Pan ride, which is every time I seem to go there, it's 120 minutes to ride that ride. I don't really know why, but it is. But is there, think about the Disney Fast Pass. It actually has how they solve their problem. Am I saying that you guys should have a Fast Pass? No. My point is that they solved the problem with a queuing theory model. What they figured out was our ride times are long, we have a problem. If, for example, in your organization, I don't know if any of you have done this on your visits to Disney or other amusement parks, but sometimes you are pre-selected to get to grab a card and you're supposed to hand it to the person when you get up to the front, and that's a way that they're measuring time. If you have a challenge in your organization to measure time, maybe think about using the same concept. All it simply is you give the card to the patient when they check in and they turn it into the nurse when they get there, and you begin to actually accumulate data just like Disney does, just like some of these large companies do. Universal, I had the experience as well, just to understand what is the time experience that patients are actually experiencing in your organization. The other thing to think about in the time tip, and I actually put this down here for pediatric, if it actually works in some other scenarios as well, but and I thought about this because I have 4 children. And when we first, my first kid was born, and she's now 20, but when my first kid was born, I remember being petrified. You know, everything that went wrong with her, it seemed like an hour to go to the doctor and discuss with them. You know, my second and third and fourth children, we just drove by the office and screamed at them basically and asked them if everything was okay. They're less tense. So when you start thinking about the scheduling, think about that. Is this patient, is this their firstborn if you're a pediatric practice? If it's an OBGYN practice, is it a first delivery? There's a lot more nerves in that, and therefore tends to actually extend the time. So maybe we should think about that when we're actually building this out. One of the things I wanted to point out in this recent study, again, is 1 in 5 patients have switched doctors just simply because they had excessive wait times. It's one of the worst things that we can possibly have happen in a practice. This is way worse than a no-show, is actually to have someone in your room, in the waiting room, and leave after just simply being exhausted because of the fact that they just hadn't been seen yet. That's possibly one of the worst things for us as an organization to actually experience. Here's a tip, here's a tip, here's a tip, here's a tip. I do that on purpose because what my goal is we simply need to inform and communicate with patients. I've had providers actually tell me that, you know, they're going to have all their patients called in this because that's what they prefer. But I'm going to remind you guys that ask the patient what they prefer. How do they want to be communicated with? And if they don't give you a platform, choose all 3 until they say, don't do that anymore. Just text me or just email me, whatever the case may be, but engage the patient and find out. What do you want to do? How do you want us to communicate with you? What can we do to make this as efficient and as effective as possible for you, our consumer, our patient? We want to be there for you and actually communicate with you the way you want to be communicated. And I will say this too, because I'm actually stunned, because I don't know why we're not doing this yet, because again, other industries seem to have figured this out. But if there's a way to add a patient visit to their Outlook account or to their Google calendars, figure it out and do it. You know, right now, a lot of you probably have had this experience if you're on Microsoft 365 or some of the other programs. But if you go out there and you make a reservation, let's just say at a hotel or a rental car or different things, I don't know if OpenTable does it, but different areas where you're making reservations or things like that, it will actually automatically populate your Google Calendar or your Outlook calendar. If there's ways in which your system could possibly do that, explore it, find that out, because again, all you're doing is helping me. I am time starved. I am going crazy in this world. I'm trying to balance work, life, just like all of you are. Our patients are in the same boat. They're not any different than any of us are in this room right now when we're listening to this presentation. So putting that and adding that and making it administratively simple for me is fantastic, because I can tell you, like, I don't know how many of you here today are listening to this, but my phone sort of drives me. I get reminders 15 minutes from now, I'm going to have to do something else. 30 minutes from now, I'm going to have to do something else. Tomorrow, I won't be able to do this. And all those are on my calendar. That's controlling my life, because I've got so much emotion and so much going on. It's the only way in which I know to keep up with it. Next tip, eligibility tip. Again, one of those areas where, as I've talked to many administrators and managers about this, and I get a lot of the same responses. A lot of them tell me the information is not 100% accurate. And if you want to know the truth, you're absolutely right. It is not 100% accurate. It is in a constant state of flux and change. We have no idea. The patient may have seen someone just a few minutes ago. Who knows? We have no idea, but it's the best that we have right now. So I encourage all of you to understand and utilize your eligibility tools. And if it's not accurate or whatever, find someone new. But most importantly, it's not the practice's responsibility to be knowledgeable. Not about every little benefit plan that we all see, we all deal with. The Blues, the Cignas, the Aetnas, the Uniteds, they have multitude of plans out there that are either direct sales or TPAs. Ultimately, it's the patient's responsibility. This is an area in which there's an engagement mechanism that we actually should be talking to our patients, letting them know we have an eligibility issue with your situation, with your account. We need to resolve that on our schedule. collect these dollars available to the practice for the service rendered, or utilize a credit card on file program. A lot of folks still are actually dabbling in the world of credit card on file, and they're still questioning a lot of it. But I will tell you, there's actually a reason why no one at Redbox calls you 2 days after you've had the movie, because they have a credit card on file. So if you had the movie for an extra 5 days, they simply bill you for it. No one calls you from Redbox to let you know that you owe that money. This is one of my favorite tips. I haven't yet figured out how to programmatically create this, but I actually think it's a fairly novel concept. But the wait list tip, and actually my idea is to go just a little bit of a deeper stab on this, is to create a dynamic wait list. A static wait list simply is a wait list with no meaning. So what I want you to do is actually start thinking about adding meaning to the patients on this list. And what I mean by that is patients who are on the list take some additional demographics into the equation. For example, if you have patients who work close by or who live close by, notate when they could come in. Because it could be if you have a no-show or a cancellation, let's say 15 minutes before the visit or whatever the case may be, it might be that if you have a dynamic list, you can identify strategically someone more likely to attend your practice as opposed to just quote the next person on the list. Now that may seem a little bit crazy, but again, what the goal here is to keep your schedule full. Notate how much time they may need to facilitate an immediate opening. So you can actually ask patients, how quickly can you be back here? What is your time frame? Like if you work in this area, if we called you 15 minutes, could you do that? There's no reason why our list cannot be a dynamic list as opposed to just simply a list of patients in a respective order. It could be that actually could be something that's more valuable to you and to them to fill everyone's needs. Utilize an on-demand text to patients to fill no-shows. Let them know you're there. Let's work. Okay, that's the whole goal. Your staff's whole goal is not to find a breathing room. It's to actually fill those schedules up. That's our job as administrators and managers, is to make sure that our organization is maximized to its fullest extent possible. Every business, that's the goal. That's what we want to do. So if we have to utilize this on-demand text, let patients know, hey, if you can come in today, we actually have an opening at 1. I don't know if you can be here, but we would love to have you. Those are kind of, again, dynamic wait lists as opposed to just static wait lists of just going the next person down or the next man up. This one's probably a little controversial. The whole tip concept is, in my opinion, it's interesting. Consider a deposit or a credit card on file for new patient visits. I've had a few clients actually do this. In order to secure a new patient visit, they actually will put a credit card on file, and that turns into the no-show fee if the patient doesn't show. Many of the challenges that I've seen a lot of practices have, and some of you may have as well, is that you will have patients call, schedule an appointment, and then you've never seen them before, and now you have a no-show slot, and you send them a bill, and they basically just simply ignore it. In this capacity, it actually puts a little value on making sure that you're going to be in attendance on this visit. Again, there are some who actually find this a little questionable, but you can begin to understand, and I hate to use this as a comparison, but I think at least it gives some color to it. But for example, if any of you are, quote, members of Open Table, then if you fail to cancel your reservation like 3 times, I think like you're kicked out of Open Table or something like that. But my whole point is to consider a deposit on things like this. I would also encourage you to consider a deposit on surgical procedures. That may be one of the worst things for us. You can certainly, all the times you can waive this if there are legitimate reasons why a patient may present or whatever the case may be. But it is something to think about going forward. If you think about GI procedures, et cetera, if one of your doctors, they're ready and they're waiting for a patient and then the patient doesn't show, that's a huge loss. It's much, much, much more severe than, say, an office visit, et cetera. Consider the no-show fee if the patient doesn't show. That's really kind of the simple concept of this whole tip. And again, some people find this a little bit on the edge. I share it simply to think outside the box a little bit. The next tip I have is actually the technology tip. And the technology tip, I mentioned this one because of the fact that what I encourage everyone to do, because a lot of times what we tend to do is again, not deviate. This is what we have. This is the system we have. I encourage many of you to begin thinking in terms of what the customer wants. Allow for the most of the registration work prior to the arrival, not just paper, like just sending someone a PDF is not an electronic form of sending us paperwork. Encourage them to actually be able to do their paperwork and suck that back into your PM system. Many PM systems now are very good with their portals, et cetera, where you can actually pre-fill in paperwork before I even arrived there. Again, focus again on those two words, time starved. For established patients, send them a reminder with a link to their demographics, so just let them check before they even show up to validate the data. Yes, my insurance card is still correct, and all that before I even get to the window, just to make it simpler. And don't accept it again. Don't accept that our system won't do that. If it won't, go out there and find someone. Google this. There's all kinds of really great products out there that are just waiting to find new PM systems to interface with. I encourage you to go find that. If you go to MGMA meetings, go around to the booth, to the vendors, find some systems. I saw some great ones when I went to MGMA National in Boston. There were some fantastic systems out there that were really wanting to hook up with new PM systems to actually push the data automatically into the system just to expedite the process. You'll find that patients will love that, and it'll take a lot of pressure off the resources within your own organization. It's a win-win situation for both sides, both the technology side for the patient as well as the technology side for the organization. It really works nicely if you can find a good partner. And I will say this, if there are, and I'm assuming this is all just managers and administrators, which is fantastic, hound your PM providers, just hound them to death. Tell them, I need to think things differently. I need to see the system in a different way. I need patients to interact in a different way. You've got to be my partner in this going forward, not my catalyst for no change. That's what's got to be. Hound your PM provider to push this. And you can tell them I said so if you want. All right. I believe this is my, if I'm not mistaken, this is my last tip, and this is one of my favorite tips because this is what I tell my kids all the time, and I think this is a great tip. Don't make your problem my problem. Do not overbook your patients for the benefit of the provider. I have done studies before and talked to practices before where they knew that they had a high rate of no-shows, and I'll give you a great example in the world of orthopedics. Had a high rate of no-shows in the world of PT. They did not want their PT staff to be underutilized, and so what they would tend to do is overbook. The problem with overbooking is it actually creates all kinds of chaos in the system. When I think about this, you'll see my next bullet point here is this comes from, and the only reason I know about the butterfly effect is because of the movie Jurassic Park, but the butterfly effect when doing this, and this is a reference to chaos theory. When you overbook patients, this phenomena has a tendency to actually create all kinds of nutsoism in the practice. This small, minute change may actually have a very, very, very significant impact in a very complex system, which our practices are. They're very complex systems. We're dealing with patients, we're dealing with their needs, their diagnosis, their symptoms, etc. Overbooking just creates more chaos for the organization. So, in my opinion, unrealized organizational costs will occur. You'll actually potentially see increased errors because we're just trying to push people through at that point. And most importantly, I think what you're going to be visualizing to a large degree, either now in the immediate situation or in an online occurrence, patient dissatisfaction. No one wants to be sitting there in a practice realizing that they have actually been overbooked. I will remind all of you of the kind of funny stories that we read online about our airline industry doing that to us. And think about how many times you may have possibly been one of those patients or people who are overbooked. Now, sometimes you get to ride first class because they overbooked, but most of the time you hear people over the intercom saying, we will give $200 and a free flight if anybody will back off of this plane. And that's because they overbooked the plane. And most of us are frustrated when we experience that because, again, it was our schedule. We went online, we booked a flight, and then we get to the airport and we find out, guess what? We're overbooked. None of us want to experience that in a physician practice. And again, it's not fair to the patient actually in their experience. And with that, I will end the presentation and take questions, comments, concerns. Hopefully this was all helpful.
Thanks, Cam. Yes, very helpful. I've gotten a couple of emails and texts saying that it's been a great presentation. So communication is live and well. I don't see any questions in the chat window, but you might take a look at yours and see if you have any.
Okay. All right. I don't see, how do I see the chat window? Sorry, forgive me.
There, yep.
There we go. All I see is a hello. I don't see any questions.
Okay. All right. Perfect.
There's no questions. There got to be at least one question. There's 3 states represented. It's got to be at least one question.
There's actually 5 states represented. So.
5 states, even more so. Statistically, there's got to be at least one question. Someone can make something up.
Go ahead and click where it says something was sent to you privately. I want to just see.
All right. Will the slides be available after the presentation? I can make them available. Yeah, I can. Jean, I gave them to you prior to. Yeah. So yeah, Jean has them. So if you guys ask,
I've got them ready to go.
Mm-hmm.
I'll get those out.
Well, you can also, one tip was stay on time. Any examples of how to do that? Yeah, actually I have a great example. So sometimes you have providers who are talky-loos, as a Southern term. One thing we do is actually use extenders or nurses to go in and actually have the conversation. So let's use the example I had during the presentation of a pediatric practice where you actually have a new mom or a new dad in the room. A lot of times just handing that person off to a staff member, to an RN to listen, because a lot of times all it is they want to do is actually talk, talk through things. So handing them off to keep the providers on point is a very effective way of doing that. I know, like, for example, my parents like to chat, and I know that the orthopedic surgeon they see, my mom has told me a bunch of positive about the extender that she always gets to talk to. So there's a great example of actually that happening to us personally. We use the patient booking their own appointment for family practice. How would you see this working for a general surgery practice? I think actually in a general surgery practice, the primary focus would probably be on the office visits and or the follow-ups, working them into the 99024s. Again, letting patients come back and book them within that 10-day period, keeping that schedule open for the providers to recognize that that's probably how their time will be utilized. That's about the only way. That's why I was mentioning earlier about a surgery. It's kind of hard for someone to book their own surgery. We are a small office with just 2 practitioners who have a 62% population of Medicare patients. Any specific tips for this population? Absolutely. They love the phone calls. So what I would encourage you to do is actually utilize phone primarily to communicate. And I would use one of the things that I think a mistake is we haven't done is we as healthcare, we have utilized robocalls for a while to let patients know reminders about their appointments. But there's actually new technology to where it actually sounds a little bit more realistic. I would encourage that, actually. I would encourage the use of some better technology, some better voiceovers, et cetera, over the experience, because they do like phone calls. If you're a small practice and you actually have the capacity, there's nothing wrong with your staff if they don't have work to do, is to put them on the phones to call a few of these patients. Again, with a population like that at 62% of Medicare, that's their preferred method of conversation is actually via the phone. So that's why I made sort of a joke about my mom and dad, but it was true. That's what their preference is. So I would encourage you to consider that. You may not be able to do all the calls, and I also respect that population. I would actually encourage you to survey them and ask them, what is your preferred methodology of communication? My dad texts like crazy. My mom does not, and my dad will gladly accept a text from me, but my mother, if you text her, you'll never communicate with her. Trust me, I'm her only son, and she still doesn't talk to me via text. Next question I got. Any tips for staying on time when we have residents and students and a provider who likes to teach and tends to get behind? That's a good one. I think in those capacities, you might have to actually modify the schedule a little bit. I think the problem that a lot of physicians actually have is their focus is on this teaching element, that's a great one. But then at the end of the month, they come in, they're frustrated with you because their compensation is down. I think sharing that correlation so that they actually can understand, yes, I'm here to teach, but I'm also here if I'm trying to make money, that those actually have to have a healthy balance. As sad as that is, it's only intended to actually show the direct correlation with this. You might be educating these residency students and you're getting your Maslow hierarchy of needs met. But if you are going to go down that pathway, I just need you to understand the ultimate potential effect it has on your compensation. We've done that before as well, where I'm not chastising the physician for doing something they thoroughly enjoy doing. I just want them to understand the ramifications of their actions. That's all, the consequences. So I think, allowing that more flexibility is great, just as long as they understand the potential effect it may have on them and doesn't put you in a pressure situation at the end of the month explaining why their compensation is less than their peers in their practice. Hopefully that makes sense. See here, I got another question, I'm sorry. How do you convince the provider who wants such a structured, templated schedule to be more open and more flexible with their schedule? This is another challenging question. I'm not sure that the age of the provider, sometimes it actually tends to have a little bit of a challenge given the age of the providers. If it's someone who's been doing this for 20 plus years, it is very, very difficult for them to actually modify structure. I think some of the things that I have done, and this again sounds sort of crazy, is actually schedule to the provider to meet with other people. And all right, so you have to bear with me on my little scenario here, is have them meet with other people and have those other people be late. And if nothing else, what it does is it reminds them that people's time and being more flexible and understanding their time is a key caveat to why you want a more open and more flexible schedule, because you actually have to deal with those people who are looking for something now. Remember that at the very beginning, and I know it was a cartoon type slide, but the competition is fierce. I encourage whoever's still on the line, if you will go to wherever you are and Google Walgreens, and what you will find when you actually pull that up, if they have minute clinics particularly, or whatever they're called, their walk-in clinics, you will actually see that they actually show the amount of time and the services available and when you can get in there and how you can schedule it online. That flexibility and that competition is something that your provider should be looking at, because that's what is in their SWOT analysis, if you will, and their threats, if you will, to their competition, to their practice. And I know, again, they don't believe that, but we're thinking in terms of just today. I think in terms of what does it look like a year from now, 2 years from now. I think that was the last question I had, Gene. I don't see any more popping up. If anybody
Thank you so much, Tim.
Yeah, I was gonna say, if anybody has any questions and you didn't get them answered, feel free to email me. I'm happy to help, or call me or text me or whatever.
Thank you all for attending, and the next webinar will be on March 28th. And as we said in the beginning, or the screen showed, to think spring. So have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cam.
All right.